Moscow's airspace is widely considered the most heavily fortified environment on the globe. For decades, the city has been encircled by rings of massive ballistic missile hunting batteries, like the S-400. To reinforce this shield recently, the Russian military took extreme logistical measures, used heavy transport helicopters to hoist short-range air defense systems directly onto the rooftops of 42-story civilian skyscrapers. While these urban missile fortresses were being constructed, Russian leadership projected an image of absolute control. Vladimir Putin even traveled thousands of miles away from the capital to mingle with crowds at a public gathering in Kazan. That carefully constructed illusion of domestic security was shattered overnight. A massive wave of hundreds of uncrewed aerial vehicles launched simultaneously, aimed straight at the capital, bypassing the entire defense network. The sheer volume of the Ukrainian offensive was staggering. Over 550 drones crossed into Russian territory, with nearly 200 of them navigating directly toward the heart of Moscow. The incoming threat sounded like a fleet of moped engines. These were slow, cheap, fiberglass drones flying low. They were heading directly into high-tech defense systems, designed to track and intercept hypersonic intercontinental missiles. How did such a slow, asymmetric threat paralyze a defense network that cost billions of dollars to build? The answer lies in the specific physical and mathematical vulnerabilities of the radar architecture itself. Defeating Moscow's shield didn't require matching their overwhelming firepower. It required exploiting the rigid algorithmic logic that Soviet-era defense doctrine was built upon. To bypass early warning detection, the drones utilized a technique called terrain masking. As this 3D profile shows, massive, long-range radar dishes emit straight signals. By skimming the rooftops and using the rugged topography to their advantage, the drones flew physically beneath the operational line of sight. Ukrainian intelligence combined this low-altitude flight profile with satellite data to map a precise digital footprint of radar gaps. Over a 500-kilometer journey, each drone's autopilot was programmed to weave perfectly through the overlapping blind spots between different broadcast zones. To protect the main force, vanguard decoy drones were positioned within the swarm. Their specific job was to intentionally distract and divide Russian command centers along the route, pulling attention away from the actual lethal payload. Reaching Moscow was an exercise in exploiting spatial gaps. Arriving completely undetected perfectly set the stage to trigger a fatal software flaw the moment the swarm reached the city limits. Look at this radar interface to understand what happens next. A system like the Pantsir can easily track a handful of targets. But when confronted with over 80 low-signature objects simultaneously, the system experiences algorithmic saturation. The processing capacity overflows, and the tracking software completely freezes. When the automated systems did manage to fire, it created a catastrophic economic mismatch. The defenses locked onto wooden and plastic decoys costing mere thousands of dollars, destroying them with interceptor missiles that cost millions of dollars each. Once a battery empties its magazine against a wave of cheap decoys, it requires significant physical time to reload. During that critical window, the airspace is left entirely defenseless against the actual strike drones trailing right behind. Now, with the billion-dollar shield completely offline, the real objective of the swarm reached its target, the highly sensitive fractional distillation towers of the Kapotnia oil refinery. Destroying this specific facility creates a massive hardware gap. These distillation towers operate on Western technology that Russia cannot independently manufacture due to heavy sanctions. Repairing this damage will take years, severely crippling their domestic energy infrastructure. The impact of blowing up an oil refinery in Moscow doesn't stay in Moscow. It ripples hundreds of kilometers away, directly stalling the static trench warfare happening on the front lines. Russian military doctrine strictly depends on vast railway networks. Massive diesel-powered freight trains are required to transport ammunition, daily rations, and troop reinforcements to the trenches. Knocking out the refinery that supplies half of the region's diesel creates an excruciating strategic dilemma. Russian commanders are now forced to pull their air defense systems away from the active front lines to protect vulnerable domestic targets. Severing the logistical fuel supply chain 500 kilometers in the rear inflicts a vastly more paralyzing strategic outcome than firing thousands of artillery shells directly at the enemy line. The economic blowback is immense. Russian gasoline production has plunged to a 16-year low, tearing a hole in the foreign exchange inflows needed to finance the production of new munitions and pay soldiers. There is also a profound psychological fracture. Moscow's elite and ordinary citizens, who previously watched the war from a safe distance on television, are now seeing the explosive consequences of the conflict right outside their own windows. By flawlessly executing this war of attrition, Ukraine is dismantling the West's fears of escalation, proving the viability of long-range offensive strategies. The devastating arithmetic of cheap unmanned technology has moved the physical limits of modern warfare. Even a capital city hundreds of miles from the front line is no longer out of reach.